And away we go with another edition of the Stampede Wrestling Show.
Let me tell you good people something, and you beer belly sharecroppers out there.
Well, he takes me to the movies, we go strolling in the park, watch the late show on TV, he holds my hand in the dark, he's a ring-a-ding-dong dandy. He's a ring-a-ding-dong dandy.
Just a minute, what's going on
He
here?
always buys me fancy candy, he's a ring-a-ding-dong dandy, and he's mine.
We're going to have a little knocking. Well, hi, everybody. As the old saying goes, batten down the hatches and lock the door. It is indeed wrestling time once more.
Welcome, fans of Stampede Wrestling, to the Ring-a-Ding-Dong Dandy podcast. Today we've got an author joining us of great interest. This is going to be Stephen Bell, and he is an author from England. He has a book coming out in the next few months called Dynamite and Davey, The Explosive Lives of the British Bulldogs. Now, Stephen is extremely knowledgeable about the history of the British Bulldogs, all the way from their time in the UK, through Stampede Wrestling, Japan, their time through the WWF, and as we'll get into, even a little bit of Davey's time in WCW. I'm not going to play a lot of clips on today's podcast. I'm going to leave it to Mr. Bell to take over and teach us about the Bulldogs more so as we look forward to his book coming out. But I am going to play one clip here. This clip is from 1989, and it's Ed Whalen interviewing the British Bulldogs. This was near the end of the Bulldogs. Within a few months of this interview taking place, the Bulldogs had essentially broken up. They were planning to make some more tours through Japan after this, but they never came to fruition. Dynamite's career, of course, takes a big, sharp turn in the years after 1990, as I'm sure most people know, but as we'll touch on in this podcast today. In any case, this is after a chain match has taken place between Dynamite Kid and Johnny Smith. Later on, those two would go on to become the British Bruisers for a few years, both in Stampede Wrestling and in Japan. Here we go with this clip from 1989, and immediately after that, we're going to start into the interview with Mr. Stephen Bell. Hopefully you have a great time listening to it.
A chain match, Dynamite. Johnny Smith is looking, well, that was disgusting.
Here's something I just can't understand. Why Johnny Smith would do this to me. And it's not the first time. Johnny Smith, Davey's brother, this is the second time. I'll tell you what. You're Davey's brother, I'm not your brother. I'm going to step into the square circle with you next week. One time, I'll tell you right now, one time only. I'll put the chain around my wrist. You put the chain around your wrist. I'll beat you from pillar to post. It's none of David's business. He already told me he's going to stand back. He's going to stay in the dressing room. And the best man will win. Johnny, you made the biggest mistake of your life trying to embarrass me. And as a matter of fact, you did embarrass me. For what reason? Next week, you see, I'm going to beat you right in that ring.
All right, and I don't think we'd better show that match on television. I was amazed. You're going against Mucka. And I was amazed at how you handled his 380 pounds. You didn't have a problem.
I'll get to Johnny Smith first. I told you a long, long time ago, Johnny Smith, that I would never, ever step in the ring with you. But now you turned the wrong way. You want the Dynamite Kid? It looks like when I was in England, I didn't teach you good enough, did I? I couldn't show you how to be a good professional wrestler. Is this the kind of stuff you want to pull? Come in the ring and cut my partners there? Well, that's fine. I'm not going to take care of it. He's going to take care of it. Myself, me, I'm going to take care of you, Welcome Singh. I don't care if you're 6'2". I don't care if you're 400 pounds. You come on. You take this 265-pound Britisher, and we'll see who's the biggest, we'll see who's the strongest, and we'll see who's the best professional wrestler in this territory, in the United States, anywhere. So Johnny Smith, you, Johnny Smith, have made the biggest mistake in your life because you have never, ever, ever stepped in the ring with a guy who's good as Dynamite Kid. And I don't want to step in the ring with you. I'll let him do the job. I'll take care of you, Welcome Singh.
Well, Great card. Great card. We hope you enjoy the action. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. However, in the meantime and in between time, that is it. Another edition of TSN Wrestling. Goodbye now.
Welcome, fans of Stampede Wrestling. This is the Ring a Ding Dong Dandy podcast. We've got an amazing guest here today. This is Mr. Stephen Bell. He has a project coming out about the life and history of the British Bulldogs. How are you doing today, Mr. Bell?
I'm great, Corey. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on with us today. You are a previously published author. This must have been a passion of love for you to be able to get into the Bulldogs history. Tell us about that.
Oh, massively, yeah. So this is my third published book, and it's so weird. I feel like it's sort of come full circle with this project because it's been sort of something that's been on my mind for a long time. Dynamite Davey from a small mining town in the north of England, just like myself, less than an hour's drive away from my hometown. And being sort of in my mid-30s now, I was a huge fan of Davey during my childhood when he was obviously the British Bulldog in the early 90s, early and mid-90s. And then as my sort of wrestling fandom got a bit deeper in my later years and I started to realise just what impact Dynamite had on that situation, started to realise about the British Bulldogs as a tag team, realised what their story was as first cousins. I really started to almost become a bit obsessed with the story, and this is going back many, many years now. So I did a lot of research, not really with any intention of ever doing anything with that research. I wasn't any kind of author at the time. It was just sort of a story that I loved and were a little bit obsessed with. Loved to read other wrestlers' autobiographies and stuff just to find out a little bit more. And then obviously the internet becoming so much more easy to use and wide-ranging and what in terms of what were available to find information and videos. And so I just really pieced it together in my mind over a long, long period of time, and then sort of by a twist of fate, followed a real passion of mine and wrote a book about a Brazilian football team that I'd fallen in love with as well. That got published and did really well. Followed that up with the biography of a pro wrestler from my hometown called Douglas Clark, who was a war hero, a rugby pioneer, and real hero of rugby league. And then after he'd finished his rugby career and been awarded all his war hero medals, he had decided to have a go at pro wrestling and became a world champion at that. And I wrote his autobiography. That did so well that it made front page news over here in the UK for our Remembrance Day. Many of the national newspapers ran the story of the book and the story of Douglas Clark as their sort of war hero story for the day for last year. That really made the book do even better than I'd sort of ever hoped, and it was really well received, and I got such fantastic feedback that by the time I'd done that, I was fully aligned with Pitch Publishing, who were the UK's biggest sportsbook publisher. And I just realised that I was in a position to have a go at Dynamite and Davey, which, as I say, a few years earlier, I'd never dreamed it. Whilst I was almost waiting for the book with bated breath, really eager for somebody to finally do it, I never dreamed that it had been me, but I found myself in this sort of position to do it. I knew that I'd got the hunger and the passion to do it, and it's ended up being bigger and better than I'd ever imagined, and I'm really pleased with how it's come together.
That's amazing, and we're all looking forward to seeing it. So you would have become a fan about the 1990s, is that right?
Yeah, so I was born in 85, so as I was sort of 7, 8, 9 year old, I was huge British Bulldog, Bret Hart fan, and then sort of wrestling fandom sort of dropped off a little bit in them formative years in between, and then really peaked back up again for the Attitude Era. Obviously Dave was still around for part of that, and what else are a teenager then? What else does a teenager want except sort of Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock and Trish Stratus, so so that really got me back into wrestling. And then obviously off the back of that, literally a couple of years into that, maybe 18 months into that, when I'd really become a little bit obsessed, and I was buying all, Mick Foley's book were out, and I really became into the behind the curtain side of wrestling, and really interested in how it all came together, and all the sort of backstage gossip and backstage antics and all that. And and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Davey died, and I remember you'll have probably certain people that they say it about in Canada as well, but what people say over here when something major happens is you always remember where you were when that happened. And the main one that springs to mind is they say everybody remembers where they were when they heard that Princess Diana had died, and the other one that gets said is Freddie Mercury. And but yeah, for me it's Davey. I remember exactly where I was when I heard that news. I just found it sort of just blew me away a little bit, because I'd sort of known him throughout my whole wrestling fandom, going back the whole sort of 10 years that I'd been watching wrestling. He was one of the very few, but just sort of probably him and The Undertaker, I think, who sort of transcended that full period, and it never looked anything more than sort of superhero-like physique and all that sort of stuff, and a real national hero when I was growing up. So it really did sort of take the breath away when I heard that news, and that was another part of me becoming really obsessed with the story a little bit and determined to sort of dig deep on it.
Yeah, we all remember where icons die, where we were, don't we? I mean, I remember when Owen Hart died, when Davey Boy died, etc. Those things always stick in your memory. They form a real part of your history going forward. How about we start back in the mid-'70s? That's when Dynamite was first getting into wrestling, and he came from a real kind of fighting-related family. He had a lot of boxing and wrestling in his family. Can you tell us a bit about Dynamite's background that way?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of rumors. It's not something that I covered in the book because I couldn't find any certainty. I did ask his family here, and they're not certain about this link to a few generations before Tom. There was an executioner, obviously, when the death penalty was around over here, hangman, I suppose we'd call him, who were from a couple of towns on, and he was, a Billington and sort of feared in the community and everything like that. There's rumours that he was a direct descendant, but I asked the family and they're not sure. They've done a bit of looking into it, and they think that might be a little bit of a misleading rumour that's gone around. But he apparently was a wrestler as well, which is another reason why that solid link comes in. But both his granddad and his dad were boxers, and real tough fighting men, and myself known in the sort of area and the sort of heritage that he had. It is that very much them sort of communities, your sort of alpha male communities where very male dominated, alpha male type dominated communities. So I can certainly relate to that type of thing. My own dad was born just a few months before Tom, as I've looked back at it. And so I've grown up with all these stories of mining, how hard times were, and I think that's something that gets overlooked with Dynamite and Davy's story, particularly Dynamite's. People from these sort of areas, are very poverty-stricken, real hard times. For a fair few decades after the war, there were no real jobs around. There was only the back-breaking mining work, really, for the men. And a holiday or a vacation was literally a couple of hours across the road to somewhere like Blackpool or Bridlington. Nobody really from that sort of standard of living left the country very often at all. There were no that was something that people from a higher echelon of society did, really, travelling abroad for holidays back then. So I think for Tom to be given that opportunity, and then David to be given the opportunity a couple of years later to go to Canada to live and work when they were still just teenagers, still just boys, I don't think anybody really ever gives that much thought about how daunting that must have been from their culture, to go into a completely different culture, and then a couple of years later to go into a Japanese culture and to sort of take to it how they did, and absorb themselves in them cultures, settle with roots there. I don't think people sort of give him enough credit for what a sort of brave decision, and how well they coped with that overall. But yeah, so Tom got into wrestling through a local veteran wrestler, Ted Betley, who spotted him a sort of a local little tearaway. Asked him to come along to his gym, agreed to give him some tuition, thinking it was probably just going to be sort of thing to, you know, keep him off the streets, keep him out of trouble. Harnesses, sort of natural. He'd got a bit of a temper on him and a little bit of a wild child, so just thought it were a way to harness them abilities. What Ted didn't realise was that Tom also excelled in his sports studies at school and was a star gymnast. It wasn't something that he bragged about or anything like that. It was just something that he had a complete natural ability for, this hand-eye coordination, real natural athlete. And so you combine all that together with his sort of natural ability for fighting, coming from a fighting background, having that bit of a temper and harnessing it in that way, coupling it up with this athletic, gymnastic ability that he'd got, and what Ted Betley had on his hands was an absolute superstar within a couple of years, and he was soon on TV, working the tours for Joint Promotions and Max Crabtree, and he became a star almost instantly, playing the babyface sort of underdog, boy against bigger men type gimmick, which was a completely natural fit at the time. And it were a sensation, and it didn't take long for him to get spotted. As most people know, it was Bruce Hart who was touring the UK for Joint Promotions. Stampede Wrestling were really struggling at the time, and Bruce was touring the UK, just wanting to see a bit of the world before his wrestling career came to an end, along with what he assumed was going to happen to Stampede, and didn't really see himself having much of a future in wrestling beyond Stampede. So we thought he'd see out his wrestling days. He were only in his late 20s, but saw himself going into teaching. Thought he'd see out his wrestling days by seeing a bit of the world. Came to the UK, saw Dynamite wrestle, and sort of had a light bulb over the head type moment that maybe, you know, this was something that the US and Canadian territories hadn't really seen. What this young kid, 170 pound, were doing, this sort of intense, high flying, hard bumping style, non-stop, like a pinball bouncing around the ring. It weren't really something that they'd seen. They were used to sort of labouring big men, and Bruce had the idea that it might be something that could set them apart if they sort of threw all the weight behind him. Stu wasn't sold on it straight away, but eventually he relented with nothing left to lose, and they flew Tom over just for a 6-week sort of trial period, and it was an absolute sensation, saved Stampede, and the rest is history. It went so well that that Davey followed suit.
You bring up a good point. They came over at very young ages. I think Dynamite was 17 when he came over to Stampede Wrestling.
Yeah, 17, 18. They were both sort of the same age. There's sort of 3 years difference in them in age, and Davey came over 3 years after Tom, so yeah, they were the same age, both sort of 17, 18.
Now, we hear stories about the coal mines in parts of the UK. I think both Davey and Dynamite grew up in the same area around Goulburn. There was a recent documentary from Adrian Street that talked about how basically it was the coal mines are fighting. Did you see that the same way for Dynamite and Davey Boy?
They were the two options, and it's so ironic how... given what happened to them, sort of especially Dynamite with his back injuries, and obviously him ended up in a wheelchair before his 40th birthday, that they actually saw wrestling as possibly the least back-breaking work, if you like. You know, his father had been a miner. Everybody that he knew, all his friends' fathers were undoubtedly miners. Like I say, my dad was. He's notoriously... back-breaking work where there's, by the time they're 60, 70, these old miners, a lot of them are deaf or struggling to walk with the back, broken down backs and things like that. So, yeah, it was definitely seen as, to them, with the sporting ability that they had, it was definitely seen as a way out of that, to break that cycle, because that is what were happening in them generations. It was, the father only knew that sort of industry, and then they'd pass that down to the son. But yeah, with the wrestling ability on that fateful day when Ted Betley spotted Tom, it gave them a real way out of it, and they took to it so well. They became so passionate about the training, really did pull out all the stops to make sure they were as good as they possibly could be, took all of Ted Betley's intense training methods on. They went to Billy Riley's Snake Pit to do some extra intense workouts in terms of ground mat wrestling and being stretched by the older kids. And they really took it seriously, really put everything they possibly could into it to make themselves the best that they could possibly be. And by the time that they were sort of 17, 18, 19, they were in a position to go and sort of revolutionise the light heavyweight, junior heavyweight sort of style across the world, really.
Now, Dynamite, I think, had his debut around age 15, but he actually won the British lightweight title within a year of his debut. Is that correct?
Yeah, they sort of threw everything behind him. He burst onto the scene, and they just wanted to sort of get him as high up the card as quickly as possible. And obviously, wrestling as regularly as there were at the time, World of Sport, which were the terrestrial TV sort of real mega show that the joint promotions aired their show on. World of Sport was a Saturday afternoon staple of British TV. Ran for several hours on a Saturday afternoon, covered all the sports that were happening, your horse racing, soccer, rugby, and joint promotions had an hour's slot within that sort of major show. So people would be watching wrestling. It weren't even... They were managing to capture people who weren't there just to watch the wrestling. They were capturing the imagination of people who were tuning in to watch other things, but they would keep it on for the wrestling. And wrestling being the nature of what it is, an entertainment show, it would undoubtedly capture people's imagination. The next thing, they'd got this flock of followers, this army of followers nationwide, and they were getting anywhere between 10 and 18 million viewers per week for World of Sport. So at just sort of 16 years old, Tom had that level of audience to impress upon, and that level of importance on everybody's sort of weekly radar. It was a big part of the week, was World of Sport, and I think that's what sort of crystallised his work ethic to sort of never have a bad match, to ensure that he was sort of working as tightly as he possibly could all the time, even just at 16 years old. He had some great people to work with in them lightweight divisions, the likes of Jim Breaks, who was a veteran heel at the time, seen as sort of the gatekeeper of those weight divisions within British wrestling. He was another one who never had a bad match, and he was perennially sort of light or welterweight champion, but he would always put over a young star who might be going to go on and make it to bigger things. So he would always sort of beat the domestic talent and sort of dominate that era. But the moment it was his turn to put somebody over because they were going to go on to bigger and better things, he would do it instantly. And he did that for Dynamite, and Dynamite won the belt off Jim Breaks. And as just a teenager, really took British wrestling by storm. He had a period where he was the tag team partner of Big Daddy, taking all the bumps for Big Daddy while he stood on the side of the ring waiting for the hot tag to go and sort of finish the match. But yeah, so that put him at the top of the card as well, where, you know, even your people who were just tuning in to see Big Daddy, who were a real sort of family sensation, sort of Harold Hogan of that era, I suppose. They were all seeing Dynamite do his thing then as well, again at just such a young age. So yeah, he became such a big part of it at such a young age, almost instantaneously, and that's why when Bruce saw him wrestle Rollerball Rocco that night in a sort of small arena at a seaside town of Cleethorpes, you know, you wouldn't believe anything ever major happened there, but that's where Bruce Hart saw Mark Rollerball Rocco and Dynamite Kid wrestle one of the best matches he's ever seen, and knew that he'd seen something really special in Dynamite.
Now, after Bruce brought Dynamite over, there was a lot of reluctance. Stu Hart was not convinced. He didn't think that this small wrestler was going to draw any money. But later on, we've got Bret Hart, whose opinion I respect greatly, calling Tom Billington, pound for pound, the greatest wrestler who ever lived. Do you agree with that? Do you think there's any wrestler that's ever compared to Dynamite pound for pound?
Well, I think, obviously, in terms of being revolutionary, like nobody had ever done what he was doing at that time, I think that is very, very apt. Yeah, I think it's correct. Now, obviously, we see that style all the time. That's the thing about being a revolution. I suppose you could compare it to something like the Beatles. 20 years later, everybody's sort of doing what the Beatles were doing, but you've got to give the Beatles the extra credit for being the ones that sort of invented what they did, and everybody else following suit. So it's easy to say, Chris Benoit or somebody else that followed after who does that same style, Daniel Bryan, they might have owned it even more, especially with modern techniques regarding nutrition and fitness. They could have even perfected it even more. But in terms of being the person who influenced it the most, brought it about, revolutionised it, yeah, I think he is. And I think Daniel Bryan's got it slightly, but I think what Tom had over everybody else who sort of copied that style, well, this natural intensity, so believable. It made his style so believable because you would swear with his facial expressions, every move was calculated. His timing was just absolutely down to a T every time, never a foot wrong. So yeah, at that time, I undoubtedly believe that he was. I won't even say pound for pound. I would just say that he was the best wrestler on the planet for the late 70s and early 80s, yes.
And you bring up good points. Changes in nutrition, changes in actual training techniques, but also the schedule. So back in the 70s and 80s, wrestlers typically wrestled on a daily basis, whereas wrestlers like Daniel Bryan right now, they're wrestling 1 or 2 times a week. That had to play a big role as well.
It does, and unfortunately that ties in hand with now they've got the sort of wellness programs and everything like that to keep the bodies in check, and they know when they've got niggling injuries, they know when they might need time off. Back then it wasn't. It was just so relentless. If you didn't work, you didn't get paid. They weren't getting paid enough to just casually say, no, I'm not feeling up to it tonight, Stu, or whatever. It was night in, night out, relentless work ethic and relentless work rate. And I think because of Tom's style and the fact that he had this obsession with never wanting to leave anybody feeling like they haven't got the money's worth out of the night's wrestling, out of the ticket money, he would go out there, even if it was a small crowd with no TV, he would give absolutely 100%. He would take the same bumps, and that was night after night after night, 250, 300 nights a year. And yeah, that takes its toll. At the time, they didn't know what toll it was taking, and that is what led to, taking substances to try and quell the effects of that intensity and that schedule. And now, as you say, they've rightly done something about that and eased the foot off the gas in terms of the schedule, saved the guys for TV, and obviously introduced a wellness program to save any niggling injuries or any sort of substance abuse that could be on the horizon, to really nip it in the bud and stop it taking hold. But unfortunately, it wasn't like that back then. They were just expected to go out there and perform every single night, and they did whatever they needed to do to keep the pain at bay to allow them to do it.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about Davey Boy. I've heard a rumor, and this is probably just a rumor, but I'd like to ask your opinion about it. The reason for the whole boy in the name Davey Boy is because when he was born, there was some kind of coding error, and he was actually listed as boy for a period of time. Is there any truth in that?
No, I heard that, and my research tells me that was an anecdote that I think maybe even Davey just started himself as a little bit of a ruse, a little bit of a story to tell. My research tells me that it's not true. That wasn't the case. It was Max Crabtree who first wanted to sort of play on the youth of Davey. Again, he was 15-year-old when he made his TV debut. Both Tom and Davey made the TV debut against the same person, actually, in Bernie Wright, or the same professional debut against Bernie Wright, who was Wonderboy Steve Wright's brother. And he wrestled under the name Dave Boy Smith. Now, a lot of people think he started as young Davey, but he started Max Crabtree to sort of play on the youth, and he had these sort of boyish good looks, real sort of baby-faced, guy was Davey Boy as a teenager, and Max Crabtree wanted to play on that to have him following Dynamite's footsteps as this real youthful babyface, managing to compete with the bigger guys and the bigger heels. Again, your likes of Jim Breaks. So he put Boy in there as a nickname, just to sort of emphasise the youth side of it. So he was Dave Boy Smith. Then to sort of emphasise that even more as time went on, they changed his wrestling name to Young David, and he stayed as Young David for quite a while. But then it got to a point where it could be argued that I think that was kind of maybe holding him back a little bit. You know, he needed to move on past that sort of gimmick of being this underdog. He was competing under his own right then, and that's when the call came from Stu for him to join Dynamite over in Stampede. So he instantly sort of wanted to drop the Young David gimmick and start afresh. And at the time, I've spoke to Bruce Hart about this. At the time, Dave Boy Green, a British boxer, was challenging for a world title. I think it was challenging Sugar Ray Leonard at the time, and Bruce suggested Davey Boy, which was already sort of on the market for Davey anyway, because it'd been Dave Boy Smith already, so they knew it was something that worked. It already had a ring to it. It had got a bit of an history because he'd already wrestled as Dave Boy Smith. So yeah, it ended up being Davey Boy Smith the moment he landed in Calgary.
That was about 1983, so Dynamite was already pretty well established. One of the interesting things about their history is that they weren't really a team in Stampede Wrestling, at least not in their early days. They were usually on opposite sides. It seems like their first time that they're actually acknowledged to be a team and become the British Bulldogs was Japan.
It was. They weren't called the British Bulldogs at all. But because Dynamite had turned heel in Stampede, he was the sort of face of the company, but as the leading heel. He was the real draw of Stampede by then, 1982, 1983, when Davey landed in Calgary. They instantly put Davey as a babyface and wanted them to wrestle against each other. They knew that they shared heritage of style. The fact that they were cousins from the fans, obviously kayfabe being absolute back then. And they set them instantly off on a program working against each other, and these matches with the two sort of sharing that style, sharing that heritage, sharing Ted Betley's training methods, despite the fact that they'd never shared a ring together because of the way they had worked out in terms of timings. You know, as Davey got onto the joint promotions tour was just the time when Tom left to go to Calgary. Yeah, it were almost like osmosis. They knew what each other were going to do, what each other were thinking, and they had these absolutely electric matches that nobody, the likes of which they hadn't really seen before in the US and Canada, or anybody really had. Completely groundbreaking and trailblazing. So they wanted that to go on as long as possible. So while Dynamite were going off and doing his Japan tours, Davey hadn't yet gone to Japan. He was holding the fort back in Calgary alongside Brett and Bruce. As sort of the main babyface at that point. And it was only when there's actually a really unique story that I think it's very, very little known that I tell in the book, and that's that New Japan wanted somebody to wrestle the Cobra for the vacant junior heavyweight title, the NWA junior heavyweight title, as it was at the time. Tiger Mask was holding the WWF light heavyweight title, and they had a gimmick of White Tiger that they wanted somebody to wrestle against the Cobra for the vacant title, and they chose Davey to go over because the Cobra had been over in Stampede and had some really good matches in their mid heavyweight division, as they called it. So they flew Dynamite over. That was his first ever trip to Japan. He went on his own, sort of against Tom's advice, really. Tom wanted him to establish himself a bit more, but he just sort of thought, no, I'm going to do it. So he travelled all the way to Japan just for a one-hit show, a one-hit tour, and absolutely tore the house down against the Cobra. But the crowd, because they were under a mask as White Tiger, and he'd got the same sort of physique, the same sort of style, the same sort of pants, tights, as Dynamite. They thought it was Dynamite on the road, so they were chanting Dynamite, Dynamite. And the Cobra got the sort of a contentious roll up towards the end. They were all cheering for Davey, thinking it was Dynamite, and when Davey whipped his mask off to reveal that it was somebody else, another sort of good-looking Englishman with the same sort of style, they went crazy for him, and they knew that they couldn't wait to see him again. And that got the New Japan bookers thinking, wow, well, look what we've got on his hands here. We don't need to stick to the both gaijin, foreigners, as gaijin as they call them in Japan. So it's almost like a three-tiered system in Japan. You've got your babyface, you've got your heels, and you've almost got your gaijin who are a little bit separate. Some are more popular than others. They tend to play the heel role against the sort of babyface hometown guys, but in general, they just sort of float between being babyfaces and heels. So where Stampede wanted to keep this program going between Dynamite and Davey, one as a heel, one as a babyface, New Japan, knowing that kayfabe were absolute and the distance that were involved between any kind of news outlets back then, they knew that there was no way anybody could find out. So they did sell them to the audience as cousins and teammates, and made them into a team for sort of their 1984 tours, their tag team tournaments and tours, and they were absolutely revolutionary. They instantly transferred that osmosis type of kinetic energy that they'd got between them, where they knew instantly what each other were going to do. They shared the same sort of pace and timing around the ring, and the double team moves were completely revolutionary. And it was sort of thing that nobody had ever seen before, and they were an absolute smash hit. So much so that Stampede turned Dynamite heel so they could become a tag team there, and it wasn't long before then obviously Vince McMahon came sniffing around them to be his major babyface team as well.
Yeah, so that takes us into 1984. Before we touch on that, though, I want to touch on Tiger Mask, because we can't talk about Dynamite without Tiger Mask, of course. Dynamite's got some fantastic matches against Bad News Allen, Bruce Hart, The Cobra, but that symmetry of matches between Dynamite and Tiger Mask is off the charts. Why do you think they had such great ability to work together?
I think it's just complete chemistry. I don't think you can quite put your finger on what it is. I think they're so matched in terms of ability, so matched in terms of style and age and just timing. I think they knew that they were only each other that could truly get the best out of one another. They knew as soon as they stepped in the ring with each other that they were capable of tearing the house down, and that gave them an extra level of confidence to go out there and do it. And unlike in a lot of when they'd been wrestling in the UK, because Satoru Sayama had been doing tours of the UK for a few years before as Sammy Lee, and during a trip home, Dynamite had picked up some spots for Max Crabtree, and they'd actually been tag team partners at a show, and Dynamite were blown away by Sayama's ability, Sammy Lee's ability on that night, and knew there and then that he wanted to work with him. So straight away Dynamite had got this extra thing to look forward to when he was paired against Tiger Mask, who had tied the Rocket to in New Japan when he'd gone back and put the Tiger Mask gimmick on him. It really gave them both an extra lift to go out and be the best they possibly could. And just absolute chemistry, worked to perfection. Obviously Tom was doing the majority of the bumping and making Tiger Mask look $1 million and putting him over more often than not. But that enabled them, Tiger Mask being the face of the junior heavyweight division in Japan, enabled them to put that title on Tiger Mask, allow Dynamite to sort of come home to Calgary and continue his stellar work there, knowing that any time he went back to Japan, he'd got these major shows, and people, because he'd been gone for a while, people were just so desperate to see him and Tiger Mask put on another show that they were just packing out arenas all over Japan. I think it just sort of escalated from there. They just knew instantly that they could get the best out of each other, and always did.
Absolutely. Now, in 1984, as you brought up, there was the movement on to the WWF. Prior to that, and later on, we would hear little snippets about some difficulties with the association between Davey Boy and Dynamite. How much did that play a role in it? Did they see dollars as a tag team that kind of brought them together? How well did they get along during those early years?
Well, one of the main things that I wanted to cover in the book was their relationship as cousins, as friends, as tag team partners, as enemies, as they ended up being. It's a real unique story. Even though they're from the village of Golborne, which I've visited, and I've been and speak to members of both the families, they didn't really see that much of each other growing up, and it weren't like they were friends. And I think Tom sort of saw Davey as getting into wrestling was almost hanging onto his coattails, following on from his success, which were true to an extent, but that also, I think, blinded Tom for a little while to just how talented Davey was and how talented Davey become. And that's why when Davey landed in Calgary, Tom to start with didn't really want him there. I think he always thought that it would take his edge off. You know, he was so unique, so trailblazing as the Dynamite Kid, that he didn't want it to be perceived that there was his cousin in town doing a very similar thing with a very similar style. So he very much made Davey earn his stripes, and you know, there's multiple stories of very harsh blade jobs and stiff working and some harsh ribs, shall we say, outside of the ring. But Davey never moaned. He just sucked it up, was awesome in the ring every single time, especially in their program with each other. And eventually it broke Tom down, and not only that, once it broke him down, broke that harsh exterior down, Tom had this fierce loyalty towards anybody who perceived as a friend, and once he perceived Davey as a brilliant worker, somebody who was getting the best out of him as well as Tom getting the best out of Davey, obviously he knew that there was this strong family connection. They became the absolute best of friends, and blood became thicker than water, and they forged this inseparable sort of relationship for many years while they were tag team partners, very loyal to each other, very dependent on each other and codependent, and just had each other's backs all the time. And that's why it was such a shame when in 1990, when it all sort of broke down between them, because Tom knew that he was on his way down, and unfortunately Davey couldn't allow himself to go down with him at that stage. He still had most of his career ahead of him, and he wanted to go back to the WWF. Tom had made it absolutely clear in no uncertain terms to not only Davey but also to Vince that he would never go back to the WWF. And so there was a parting of the ways, and Tom unfortunately saw that as a kind of betrayal, because they forged that level of bond and that level of friendship and that level of partnership, that he saw that as a really bad betrayal, and it's something that he never really forgave or got over.
In 84, when they went to WWF, there was a lot of uncertainty as to what they were doing there. They were kind of in a holding pattern. You had Brett teaming with Dynamite, you had some singles action, before they actually came out as the Hart Foundation and the Bulldogs. Did you get a sense of whether or not they actually had thought about leaving WWF at that time, and we maybe never would have had the Bulldogs?
They did leave the WWF at that time. They Vince signed Brett, Jim, Dynamite and Davey just sort of as part of the deal. Well, sorry, Jim was down in Florida. He came slightly later, but certainly Brett, Dynamite and Davey came as part of the Stampede package when he purchased Stampede in 1984. And Dynamite and Brett went and did some spots for the WWF, and they did the tag together and did some singles matches. Just jobber matches really against enhancement talent. But what Tom didn't realise, Brett did, was that they got paid an absolute minimal amount for TV, because these matches were aired on TV, and they were aired on TV in Canada as part of the WWF's Canadian branch that were just starting out on TV. And they got paid an absolute minimal amount, mate. I can't remember off the top, something like $25.
$25, that's what I heard too.
Yeah, for the show, because it were deemed that the exposure of TV was worth more than sort of any monetary value that Vince could pay them at the time. They got paid the majority of the money through house shows as a percentage of the gate, and Dynamite didn't take kindly to being treated as just sort of one of the. He was used to being a real main man, both in Calgary and in Japan. When he walked in the WWF, he was treated as a lower mid-carder. He felt, the way people spoke to him were different, the way people treated him were different, and then they handed over this $25 check. And he wasn't impressed. They did pick up a couple more shows alongside Davey, but he'd already made his mind up that he felt his art lied in Japan. He'd heard rumours or felt that if they did sign with the WWF, there would be far less time spent in Japan. The WWF, as part of their expansion and gathering up of all the talent, were signing people on sort of exclusive deals, which hadn't been done before. The territories and the Japanese territories all sort of shared talent across the territories and across over to Japan and between Canada and the US. So that gave the talent a level of freedom to go where they wanted and earn the money that they felt they could earn, and sort of use that leverage against each other. And that's just the way it worked. And Dynamite liked that. If he knew his worth in that system, and he knew his worth particularly in Japan. So even though Stampede Wrestling was no more because Vince had bought it out, he saw the opportunity to just work 6 months of the year doing the Japanese tours backwards and forwards, resting up in between, and he could still earn really good money and have a really good lifestyle based on that, and just sort of pick up the odd tour of the UK in between. And he was more than ready to do that and sort of not join the WWF, whereas everybody else around the era was scrambling to get to New York, as they called it, and earn the money that was sort of being a lot more lucrative because of what Vince McMahon had created. There was rumours that both the NWA and the AWA were sniffing around both Tom and Davey after they'd quit the WWF that first time. But they never signed for them. Again, there were rumours there that they felt that they were too small for their major promotions and to headline for them for the kind of money that Dynamite and Davey were demanding at that time, because there was such a big draw in Japan and knew what they could earn if they did decide to go back to the WWF. So it was actually then in 1985, just around the time of WrestleMania 1, that the value had increased even more. They were doing such amazing work in Japan. They jumped by that point to All Japan in what's over a sensational transfer to the rival opposition. Nobody really did that in them days. It really caused a global stir, but that, there's sort of no publicity is bad publicity, as they say. So it made even more people stand up and take notice. They were a real global sensation by that point, and that's when Vince saw them as... He found out on the grapevine that they were first cousins as well, and saw that as an extra selling point. Saw what they'd become. They were getting bigger, meaner, stronger, better all the time. And so then... around the time of WrestleMania 1 in 1985, that it made them an offer they couldn't refuse, and they did finally join permanently the WWF then, and they even managed to negotiate with Vince, or Dynamite negotiated with Vince, that they could still do the Japanese tours, certainly for that first year, and they did. They still did honoured all the commitments to All Japan throughout 1985.
Now, one of the biggest time points in Dynamite's career is a house match. It's a house show match that took place in late '86. It was with Morocco and Orton. Now, in Dynamite's book, Pure Dynamite, he talks about this. There's a lot of disparity when you look in different reports. Some people say that he got a bad knee to the back. Some people say he fell to the outside. But Dynamite believes, and when you watch the video, I believe it too, that he just had something happen in his back, probably a herniated disc, while he was just running across the ring. And of course, that set him up for a time of rehabilitation. He lost a lot of time in the ring, and he lost a lot of his ability, particularly his gymnastics ability down the road. How do you see that point in time for him?
Yeah, it was major, but it was just sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. I think he'd had back problems for many, many years. In fact, the night that he actually finally won the WWF Junior Heavyweight title in Tokyo, he beat Davey Boy in the semi-final, and they do this amazing spot, which is a suplex over the top rope, where they both go flying over the top rope and out of the ring, and Dynamite just manages to crawl back in to win on a count out to qualify for the final, which he beats the Cobra in the final. Now he completely he smashed his back on the ring apron as he went over, and there's many witnesses that say that he'd got this sort of huge lump, which probably was some kind of herniated disc from that injury that night, and realistically no human should have even been walking that night, and he managed to go on and have another match and beat the Cobra. And that was where he'd already had back problems before that, but that was when it really started, and that increased his dependency on pain relief and even alcohol being used to relieve that pain. So that went on and on. He wouldn't let it change his style. He carried on taking the heavy bumps, doing the high spots. And yes, it was just getting worse and worse and worse all the time. His dependency on the substances were getting worse and worse and worse all the time. And yeah, I agree with what you've just said. I have heard that there were some theories going around that it was Orton's knee as Dynamite's coming off the ropes. But I think when you look at it, I don't think Morocco really touches him with that knee. I think it's as he's leapfrogged Bob Orton as he lands. It's obviously so innocuous. There's nothing really there that you can see, but instantly he just you see him sort of grimace as he comes off the ropes. Then he just collapses to the floor. I've heard Don Morocco talk about it recently, and he's absolutely certain that that's the case. He says that there was virtually no contacts, and him and Tom spoke about it straight away after, and Tom agreed.
So now you've got a situation where Tom Billington's not able to wrestle. They have the match with the Hart Foundation in Florida where they basically just give up the titles. And then Billington's away for a little while, but he comes back. He comes back not too many months later. It was a very short rehabilitation time for him. But now their style has changed, and they have to compete more as muscle men. How did you see that time in 1987, 1988? Yeah,
it's really quite sad because, as you say, they've been so explosive before that, and that kind of got taken away. Tom did come back far too soon, there's no doubt about it. He got told straight away, you will never wrestle again, you can never wrestle again. He told the doctors that's just not an option. I will be wrestling again, and through the use of extra substances, extra steroids, extra working out in the gym, doing his own sort of form of physiotherapy, whatever he thought could get him through it the best. He managed to get through it in a matter of months, get himself back able to compete again, but not to anywhere near the same level that he had done before. But again, it was the type of contract that they had and the type of industry that it was back then that forced them into rushing that way. You know, they only got paid if they were working, and there was WrestleMania. They earned sort of reasonable money the rest of the year, but then they'd got these couple of shows a year, just these pay-per-views every now and again. So you'd got WrestleMania, probably Survivor Series then, or right before the first Survivor Series. No, they probably got the two, but that was the only chance to have these major paydays. So WrestleMania being on the horizon, it meant that his target to come back and compete at WrestleMania 3, and he did. He made it. It ended up being one of his biggest ever paydays. So he classed that as being a job well done. He'd managed to perform this sort of miracle rehabilitation to earn this big payday, but long term, he certainly didn't do himself any favours, and it was just sort of masking the problem and able to get through it. And as you say, that meant that they had to wrestle with a different style, and there was no doubt that once they went down the route of being a more heavyweight style team and a powerhouse type team, there was no doubt that then Davey Boy was going to be the main man, and the Tom's career was only going to go one way from that point. But what that did was give Davey the opportunity to really showcase himself and his talent and his power that he generated in himself. And suddenly all eyes were on Davey, and he didn't disappoint, and obviously forged an amazing singles career for himself off the back of that.
Do you think that led to some jealousy between the two?
I do, yeah. I think, I don't know if jealous is the right word, but I know exactly what you're getting at, and I agree. I think it was a little bit of resentment on Tom's part. I think he'd seen himself, and I'm not sure it was anything personal at that stage. I think he'd just so long seen himself as this leader, this pioneer, blazing a trail and everybody following in his wake, and suddenly he was having to rely on somebody else, and I just don't think that sat well with him. I think pride was it was prideful to a fault almost, where having pride, especially in that kind of industry, is an amazing thing, and it was his pride in his shows and his ability that forced him to make himself as good as he could possibly be. But then it was that same pride that when he could no longer perform to the same standard that he could, and he needed Davey to pick up most of the slack, it was that same pride that made him resentful, and that was probably another factor in him turning more to alcohol and substances to sort of pick himself back up when he was feeling down on the road, when he'd only got this, and he was turning more and more to the more fierce pranks that we've heard about and fierce ribs. And I think it was, things began to spiral for him because of that.
But through it all, I saw Davey Boy as being very loyal through many occasions. You had the whole Rougeau situation, which I'm sure you talk about in your book. But then in '88, basically, I think related most to finances, Dynamite wanted to leave WWF, which I'm sure Davey looked at as a financial no-no. And then they ended up in Stampede Wrestling on a much smaller circuit. They were going to Japan. During that time, Davey Boy must have started having some feelings about whether or not his loyalty was misguided, do you think?
I do think he did, but his loyalty at that stage was completely ultimate. Like it was non-negotiable. When Tom said we're leaving, David didn't question it for a second. He will have known in the back of his mind. I'm sure him and Diana had real concerns about the income that they were giving up. They were just raising a small family that just bought a huge house on the outskirts of Calgary, had a huge mortgage to pay. Tom was in a slightly more stable financial position at that point. He'd been earning bigger money for longer, didn't have the financial burdens that Davey had. And I think Davey was desperate to earn more money than what their new situation could provide. And I think that over the course of the following months and years, Davey were involved in a bad car accident, a van crash, in which that led to him being out of the ring for many months and earning even less money. And it came to a point where financially he had no choice but to start thinking about going back to the WWF. Vince bumped into them in Japan. He was there to negotiate a collaboration with All Japan, a show that they had coming up, and he were impressed with the BULLDOGS, saw that they were still appearing to be as good as they were when they'd left the WWF a couple of years earlier. So he went to see them in the locker room backstage and told them that there would be a job waiting for him if they wanted it. And Tom, without thinking for a second, just said, "No, I'll never come back." Davey told Vince that his door would always be open too, and that straight away caused some friction. So much so that when the WWF reached out to Davey to replace Brutus Beefcake, who just had his accident in Florida, that Davey Boy just couldn't say no, and that was when he seemed to avoid telling Tom directly, which I think Tom saw as an extra part of the betrayal. He just sort of didn't turn up for their next for the flight to Japan. Tom found out on the grapevine around Calgary that was going to happen, and got Johnny Smith to take Davey's place, and took Johnny Smith as his tag team partner, and they never spoke, saw each other, or wrestled together again from that point on. And Tom really did see it as a betrayal.
Amazingly sad that they would never meet up again over the remaining years. That's terrible loss. It was in 1990 when Davey Boy made that decision to jump to the WWF, and he took with him the name of the British Bulldog. That must have also irked Tom to some extent.
Yeah, he didn't find out about that straight away. He only found out about it when he was told, when he was wrestling back in the UK, that he couldn't use the name. And yes, that was an absolute sting in the tail after he already felt so betrayed. But I'll detail more about that than's ever been written or spoke about before that situation. I'm led to believe, and this is the way I've written it, is that Davey offered Tom to take the name together as a tag team, to take the name the British Bulldogs together, but there was a high fee involved in that trademarking. So Tom refused to do it, saying, look, I don't really see the issue, but what benefit Tom had got that he didn't have, that David kind of didn't have on his part, was he was the Dynamite Kid. His name, particularly in Japan, was etched in stone. He'd never had to trademark that name. He was the one and only Dynamite Kid. Davey looked into trademarking because he was friends with Hulk Hogan, and they were all doing it because it gave them extra leverage. Vince was starting to tie up the trademarks for the intellectual property type purposes. It were a time when all that would be coming up. He really didn't want people jumping ship after Ted Turner had just took over at the NWA and WCW was born. They were starting to splash the cash and looking to take people from the WWF, and what Vince was starting to think, well, it's all right if they can taking the talent is one thing, but taking the gimmick that we've spent them years creating, he really wanted to guard against that. So he was just in the process of starting to tie up these trademarks as intellectual property. And the British Bulldogs was readily available. It wasn't trademarked, so David decided that he were going to do it. And so it was only when Tom said, no, I'm fine, I'll leave it, thanks. David said, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. I've actually seen the copyright paperwork, and it's interesting that it actually says on it, the British Bulldogs, plural, it doesn't say the British Bulldog. So that would suggest that the sort of first application was made for the plural name, which would indicate that it was applied for as a team. But because it was David that sort of stumped up the money and signed on the dotted line, he became the British Bulldog, certainly in the eyes of the law, but it was only a few years later when it was actually used, when they'd sort of split up and gone the separate ways, and they both tried to be a British Bulldog. Davey was the British Bulldog, and Tom, unfortunately, wasn't.
Now, back in '89, in Wrestling Storyline, Davey and Dynamite started their split in Stampede Wrestling, and that's when you got the involvement of Johnny Smith. There was supposed to be, and this was celebrated in Western Canada, there was supposed to be a Battle of the Bulldogs. And as you alluded to earlier, Davey Boy got into a car accident, and it never really went down, and that could have been a big boon to Stampede Wrestling throughout 1989. Did you discover much about what was happening at that time? Did they ever try to get that feud going again, to try to have a Bulldog versus Bulldog match?
No, well, what a bit of a dark time for Tom. There'd been some real infighting with the Hart family. He wasn't on good terms at the time, so he was missing a lot of shows, and he was spending long periods where he weren't actually an active part of the roster. So they'd started this program, they called it the Dogfight of the Decade, but then it was after that all this sort of controversy started happening with Tom. So another problem was that Ed Whalen wasn't a fan of the Dogfight of the Decade. He didn't believe that they should have split them up. He loved them as a tag team, thought they should have stayed as baby faces, the British Bulldogs, and been the faces of Stampede Wrestling. So Ed Whalen had a certain level of creative control at Stampede, and so that did have an impact on how much they pushed that program and where they pushed that program and how much TV time it got. So it didn't impact the way that they really wanted it to impact. They did have some matches, just sort of house shows, doing the tour of Western Canada that they used to do, but they never got to see it as the program never reached its climax. By that point, Tom had his fallings out, and they'd sort of shifted gears a little bit, and that's why Tom wasn't on the bus when it had the crash. But then that injured Davey Boy so badly that he was going to be out of action for such a long time, and Stampede Wrestling really, really looked like it were going to go to the wall. So Stu reached out to Dynamite to come back, and as a replacement for the Dogfight of the Decade feud, they brought Owen back as well, who'd had an unsuccessful period with the WWF as the Blue Blazer. So out of nowhere, they lost Dynamite and then lost Davey. But then they brought back Dynamite and Owen, and Dynamite and Owen went on and had a series of street fights and really good matches, which weren't good enough didn't draw quite well enough to save Stampede. Stampede did go out of business, but they are the matches that sort of sent it out with the bang that it deserved.
So now we're in a situation where Dynamite is basically going back to the UK. He makes some trips to Japan periodically, and I think he was there as late as 1996, but you can see what's happening with his body over time, probably due to a lack of using steroids, but also probably due to, I'm going to guess, change in training habits as well. And then the match in 1996, where it was kind of a six-man tag in Japan, where it was not the same Dynamite. As he referred to himself, he called himself a skeleton at that time. During that time, what was happening in his personal life?
Things were bleak for him. He was working as a security guard overnight at a local scrap yard. Actually, I was living on the corner of the yard as well. So almost drifting into a bit of poverty. He could no longer wrestle. He was doing a few shows here and there, very rarely in the UK, but the money was so poor that it wasn't worth, even though he needed the money badly, the money was so poor that it wasn't worth putting his body through the torture that it was. And so Michinoku Pro was a start-up promotion back then in Japan, so they reached out to him to do this Legends match to try and boost their promotion as it were just starting out. So yeah, he went over there and did that just because the money was actually worth it. He felt on that occasion, but it was a bit of a tortured soul at that point, because he certainly felt that, he even said himself that it was the first time and probably the only time in his career that he didn't feel worth the money that he was being paid as a performer, and that wasn't good for a man with his level of pride. Even when he was sort of broken down wrestling in the UK, because he wasn't getting paid that much, he still felt that it was more than worthy of that money, and more than worthy of putting bums on seats and earning that money back for the promotion. But he didn't feel that way about the Michinoku Pro show, which turned out to be his last ever match, and it proved to be that way because his body was under so much strain by then that the travel and the show forced him to have I think that was his third seizure as he was travelling home, which were really the start of serious health problems. Those seizures over time, within a year or so after that show, he was in a wheelchair. Those seizures started to turn into strokes in later years, and we saw the real breakdown of the Dynamite Kid.
Now, Davey Boy came back to the WWF and had some pretty good runs. I mean, he had a fantastic match with Brett at Wembley. He went back and forth between WCW and WWF a few times. But in '94, he actually came over and I think tried to become a promoter/booker in the UK around that time. Now, I'm not sure what was happening with independent wrestling in the UK at that time, but independent wrestling in North America at that time was pretty much down to nil. How was it during that time in the UK? Could it have made a profit? Could it have stayed lively?
Well, what he were actually doing was, so he'd lost his job with WWF and subsequently lost his job with WCW. So him and Diana came home and the kids came back to Goulburn. They set up an office in Davey's mum and dad's house, and they were effectively running Davey as his own promotion, but working on other independent shows, but he was almost like a subcontractor to them. So yeah, it were a little bit of a original idea that they'd got, and it were working really well. Big Daddy by then, thankfully for everybody involved, had just hung up his boots. So there was this spot available as the main event and the main attraction for the tour, for the UK Joint Promotions Tour, run by Max Crabtree. So Davey filled that spot for a good period of time, trading himself out under this as the British Bulldog under his own company name, as well as his own wrestling trademark name. And it was going quite well as could possibly be expected, given the fact of what UK wrestling was back then. You know, it was still only sort of small halls and bingo halls and seaside towns and town halls, that kind of thing. You know, wrestling in front of hundreds rather than thousands. So it was going as well as it possibly could, but it was actually when I've heard the story quite recently, actually, that it was when he watched Brett and Owen tear the house down in the opening match of WrestleMania 10 in 1994. He sat and watched that in his mum and dad's house, the house that he'd grown up in Golborne, and that was the moment he realised that he needed to go back. And by SummerSlam 94, he was back with the WWF, but it was that match that convinced him that he wrestling in these small halls, even though it was proving quite profitable and he were enjoying being home and being back with his family, it just wasn't enough for him, and he needed to go back and have them big shows again.
So now we're taking ourselves into the late 90s, and of course, Davey Boy's loyalty proves true again. He leaves WWF when Brett leaves. I think that was mostly on the basis of loyalty. He ends up in WCW where he fails to make any kind of splash. And then the injuries start to set in. There's the situation with the trapdoor that happens. What's happening around that time with Davey Boy and his career? What's he thinking about doing kind of after wrestling? I guess he's probably getting close to 40 by that time.
Yeah, so late 30s back then, but it had been an awful long 20 year in the business from when he started, again having that same sort of style that Dynamite had, particularly in his early years of the heavy bumping. He'd had back and knee injuries for so long, so much so that history had repeated itself, and unfortunately Davey had then generated a substance abuse problem to try and deal with the pain and just to be able to work and make a living for his family. Again, that schedule was still pretty relentless by then in the late 90s. And so, yeah, WCW had left, as you say, purely out of loyalty to Brett. But the creative was so poor in WCW at the time that he found it hard to get motivated, and his motivation for his wrestling storylines, his wrestling angles, and wrestling itself, he just loved being in the ring, was the only thing that was sort of keeping him staying, for the want of a better word, I think, you know, during his time with the WWF. And when he lost that, and he lost his spot on the WWF card and was lower down on the WCW card against poor opposition, he found it really difficult to get motivated. And just like Dynamite had 10 years earlier, things began to spiral out of control for him, unfortunately, with his painkiller addictions, especially after the trapdoor incident that had been placed there for the Ultimate Warrior at the pay-per-view. He unbelievably, a bit like Dynamite had, carried on wrestling when he had the most horrendous, well, pretty much a broken back, carried on wrestling, but the matches were so short and so poor, he couldn't get his opponents up for his power moves anymore. But WCW were just sending him out there, you know, again, no wellness policy, nothing like that, and things spiraled out of control. They fired him because he was completely admitted to hospital by then. It generated a staph infection in his back. WCW fired him for lack of action. And that's when, you know, everybody assumed, there was reports in the dirt sheets that at best his career was over. At worst, he could die. This staph infection was so bad that it could kill him. The likely outcome, I've read Dave Meltzer's piece on it, the likely outcome at that point seemed to be that it was just, history was going to completely repeat itself and he was going to be in a wheelchair like Dynamite. But when he was given a beacon of hope by Owen, that Vince would always leave the door open for him and that there might be a spot back available with the WWF if he could get himself fit and healthy. He really took the bull by the horns and got himself fit and able to work again. And amazingly, and a surprise to everybody, in 1999 it was back working with the WWF and was soon actually main eventing pay-per-views again. It's a real miraculous recovery, and one that I think gets overlooked. Just what an amazing recovery that was, to get back to the top of the industry when it had almost written him off.
Yeah, I remember that run in the late 90s. He did very well. I mean, he had some great matches with The Rock, There was a series of matches with Big Boss Man, so he was doing quite well at that time. Now, both of these wrestlers had tragedy throughout their careers, of course. Our last podcast had Bronwyn Billington on, and she's a Dynamite doll, Dynamite's daughter, of course. And she talked about a great moment where her and her father spent time at home in UK, and he said simply, "I'm sorry." And the fact that he was able to have this great moment with his daughter. For Davey Boy, he had a couple of matches at the end of his career with his son, Davey Boy Smith Jr., or Harry Smith. And I think he was only about 15 or 16 at the time then too. Did you ever get a chance to talk with Harry Smith to find out about how that time went, how he saw his father at that moment?
It's funny you should ask. I actually exchanged some messages with Harry, but he sort of had to cut the communications off. I sort of still been in communications with him indirectly through other people, I suppose, but he had to cut them communications off because he'd just re-signed with the WWF, and it's limited to what they can get involved with in terms of outside things. So no, but I've seen a lot of interviews with him where he talks about the subject and read a lot of things. So I do cover it in depth. It's the closest thing to a happy ending on Davey's part, and it really is. It's yet another, a bit like he'd done 2 years earlier. He makes another miraculous recovery to get back in ring shape at the age of 39 after another period out of the ring when he's had to go into rehab and had more infections. He'd had a motorcycle accident, but he manages, is again the beacon of hope that's driving him this time is to one day wrestle with Harry as a tag team, and he starts telling people that they'll wrestle as the New British Bulldogs and have a run as the New British Bulldogs, and they managed to have 2 matches together right at the end of his life. He dies just a week later, tragically does Davey. But yeah, Harry's spoken quite really well about that, and what an amazing, unforgettable sort of 2 nights it was that neither of them that he'll certainly never forget, and it certainly was the closest thing to an happy ending for Davey. With regards to Bronwyn, Bronwyn has helped me so much, and she told me that same story so much so I loved that story so much that I didn't feel that I could tell it better than she tells it. So I offered her. She'd been so amazing throughout the production of the book, offering me so much insight, so much of her time, so much of her contacts. She's given me exclusive photos, exclusive stories, that I offered her the opportunity to write, as I've called it the afterword, where she effectively tells the story of Tom's last 10 years through her eyes, and as she knew him, as she got reacquainted with him, she tells the story of how they became reacquainted, how they sort of fell back in love again as father and daughter. The story where he does say sorry to her, and when she has to leave him again for that final time. It's a real heart-wrenching sort of ending to the book, and one that I'm really proud that she took up my offer to do. Similarly, at the start of the book, the foreword is written by Ross Hart, and that's because Ross had again helped me to such an extraordinary level, beyond anything I could have ever hoped for in terms of his time and his availability and his giving of information. It's that I offered him the chance to write the foreword because I felt them 2 people, in Ross and Bronwyn, deserve to have the name on the cover of the book alongside mine. So yeah, it's obviously my name's on there as the author, but it's foreword by Ross Hart and afterword by Bronwyn Billington, and I'm really proud of their involvement. I'm proud of how they're proud of what's been produced. They were both, along with other people I spoke to, very cautious when they first heard about the project in terms of what it entailed and what its objectives were. But I've managed to sort of win almost everybody over with that and convince them that this, from a UK book publisher's point of view, this is completely unique. Nothing like this has ever been done before. Nothing's ever been done before worldwide, but I think there'd be an element from a US or a Canadian point of view that certain parts of the story, I mean, I've got so many exclusives within the story. Keith Hart has given me a brilliant exclusive. But I tell it from a UK point of view in terms of them being young lads in a small mining town in the north of England, and I managed to convince them that it was a story that desperately needed telling, that I had no ulterior motives. It weren't going to be some kind of hit job, as people like to refer to these things, at all. I cover the controversies, I cover the negative aspects, but I apply so much context, so much background, that undoubtedly both Tom and Davey come out looking amazingly, and I've had that confirmed by the proofreaders who've read it so far. So yeah, Ross calls it the most balanced work that's ever been done on the subject that he's read. He thinks it's completely fair and balanced and honest. And yet their pride in what's been produced has sort of really, really made me proud in turn.
After Davey Boy's death in 2002, I know Dynamite's book, Pure Dynamite, came out before then, so you wouldn't be able to comment in the book. Did Dynamite ever make any public comments about Davey's death?
I never heard him mention his death, and I think he was too... Personally, I think it was too loyal still to do that or to speak out of turn once it had got to that point. No, I never heard anything. The last I heard him mention him was in a radio interview, which I cover in the book. That's while Dave is in rehab, and he does have a little little dig at Davey in his situation there. I think it's still very raw, little situation at that point. But after Davey had died, I mean, I've seen many interviews with Tom that he did. Well, not I say many. There weren't that many because he didn't do many, but a couple that I've seen in his sort of small flat that they went in his small apartment that they conducted some of them in. There's still a huge framed poster and trophy with him and Davey together. I still think that despite the exterior and the bravado and his pride that just constantly got in the way of him ever being able to reach out or apologise to anybody, and that's what's so amazing about that final apology to Bronwyn. His pride seemed to always stop him doing that, and I think that's what always stopped him doing that with David. But once David had passed away, I never heard him mention his name once, which I think will probably mark a respect.
Mm-hmm. You've been very generous with your time today, so I only want to ask one more question. We've got a team together that, of course, won the World Championship as a tag team, but neither were ever singles champions at the world title level. Obviously, I think that's misguided. I think that they probably had the abilities that they could have carried that title very well. We saw them with intercontinental runs. We saw Dynamite with junior heavyweight runs. What would you have seen out of a world title run with either of them? Would you have seen that as legitimate?
Absolutely. I think Dynamite was probably just slightly too much ahead of his own time. He broke that glass ceiling for the smaller wrestlers. So obviously he was above Brett in the pecking order during the Stampede and Japanese in the early years in the WWF. And obviously people like Shawn Michaels coming through in the wake of Dynamite, he really opened them doors for them smaller wrestlers. So at the time, that opportunity just wasn't there. You know, he was never gonna headline WrestleMania against Hulk Hogan or Andre the Giant, and wrestle one of them for the big belt. It just weren't gonna happen. But there was the nature of what it was. But he was busy at that time breaking them barriers down for the others that followed. So I don't think it were ever realistic for Tom. I think the highest as an individual accolade he were ever going to get was the World Junior Heavyweight title, which he did win and had a great run with and never got beat for. He vacated it because they jumped to All Japan. I think Davey is astonishingly unlucky to have never got a world title run in either WWF or WCW. I think that was just more of a timing thing. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride kind of thing. He was so good at making his opponents look great, and they always knew that. So we were always pitted in them big matches. So they'd put him in there with the likes of Diesel, for example, to try and get the best out of Diesel. You'd put him in there with Brett, knowing that they were going to have this amazing match because of the chemistry and the knowledge of each other's matches. During his time in WCW, they'd got... They always tended to have heel champions as their perennial sort of champion with the babyface chasing all the time, and eventually somebody like Sting might win it for a short period, but it won't be long before it went back to the heel that was holding the belt at that time were Vader. Davey was in a long program with Vader at that time, wrestling him night after night, beating him by DQ. So he was in that position, I think, just for, a slightly different booker or different politics or anything. That belt could have gone to Davey at any time. During his second run, or third, I suppose, if you count the initial one, he was in such a strong position on the WWF card, wrestling Brett, who was the champion at the time when he turned heel, wrestling Shawn in a long program with Shawn for the belt. Again, I think on any given day, any given booker or any given sort of politics or program that they wanted to have in the run-up to a Mania, I think he was always in that position where they could have given it to him, and it was just a timing thing where they never did. But it's really unfortunate. It does feel like a bit of a glaring omission, really, but not so much so now he's been admitted to the Hall of Fame. I think when he was neither in the Hall of Fame or had a world title, it kind of felt like he'd been not forgotten, but certainly undervalued. I think the Hall of Fame induction goes some way towards making up for that.
That's been great. This has been a fantastic hour. I've learned so much more about Dynamite and Davey than I ever knew before. So I want to highlight, your name of your book is Dynamite and Davey, The Explosive Lives of the British Bulldogs. Can you tell everyone about how they can access it, where they can purchase it from?
So yeah, its official release date is in April next year, so we've still got a few months to wait, but there is multiple ways that we can place pre-orders now. You can do it through my own website, which is stephenbellwrites.com. There's an eBay page set up for anybody who wants to place a pre-order that way. But anybody can get in touch with me on social media and place a pre-order that way. I'm at Stephen_Bell1985. And I've actually got a dedicated Twitter page for the book, which is at Bulldogs Book 123, or it's just titled Dynamite and Davey. I'm sure you'll find it easy enough. I've put some exclusive content on there, pictures and sneak peeks of the sort of rough and ready first drafts from given days when it's the anniversary of that date. So yeah, it's quite interesting. I get some good feedback from that. So anybody wants to give them a follow, they're more than welcome. And as I say, you can get in touch with me to place a pre-order or go to my website. That'd be great.
That's fantastic. It's such a big role they played in the history of wrestling, as you pointed out, especially with Dynamite Kid. And they've got big links to British wrestling, North American wrestling, Japan, Canadian wrestling. They really did cover the world. So thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate all your time with us today, and best of luck with your book release.
Thank you very much, Corey. It's great to see you. Thanks for that.